Hello, class. This is part 2 of the lecture on the chapter 26 in Matthew's Gospel. And so we'll pick up where we left off from the last lecture with verse number 36. Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane and said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee and began to be grieved and distressed. Then he said to them, "My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch with me." And he went a little beyond them and fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Not as I will, but as you will." We see in the commentary, Jesus went to a place known as Gethsemane. There Jesus left his disciples, except for Peter, James, and John, who went with him, and he began to pray. He was experiencing sorrow and trouble such as he had never known in his earthly life. He asked the three disciples to stay and watch with him. In this hour of his greatest need, the Lord wanted those with a sympathetic understanding to be praying with him. Separating himself from the three, Jesus prayed to his Father, asking that if possible this cup be taken away from him. The cup probably referred to his imminent death. He may have had in mind his coming separation from the Father and his coming contact with sin as he became sin for mankind. A cup, figuratively, in the Old Testament refers to wrath. The significant thing about this prayer, however, was that the Lord submitted his will to the will of the Father. Verse 40, and he came to the disciples and found them sleeping and said to Peter, "So you men could not keep watch with me for 1 hour? Keep watching and praying that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Jesus went away again a second time and prayed, saying, "My Father, if this cannot pass away unless I drink it, your will be done." Again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. Look at the commentary. When Jesus returned to the three, the inner circle, he found them asleep. He awakened them and reprimanded Peter for his inability to bear with him in prayer. Only a short time earlier, Peter had twice said he would never forsake the Lord, and yet he could not even pray with him in his greatest need. Jesus encouraged them to keep watching and praying, but he did acknowledge the weakness of human flesh. As Jesus prayed a second time, he recognized the cup could not pass away unless he drank of it. He affirmed a second time that God's will must be accomplished whatever the cost. He returned and found the three disciples asleep again, but this time he did not wake them. Now we come to verse 44. And Jesus left them again, and he went away and prayed a third time, saying the same thing once more. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. Behold, the one who betrays me is at hand." While he was still speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12, came up, accompanied by a large crowd with swords and clubs, who came from the chief priests and elders of the people. Now look at the commentary. A third time Jesus prayed the same prayer while the disciples slept on. Their sleeping and resting was in stark contrast to his agonizing and praying to the point of exhaustion and perspiration. Jesus was lonely, for though his disciples were nearby, they were useless in their intercession, and yet he evidenced unswerving obedience, determination to follow the Father's will regardless of the cost. When Jesus returned to the disciples the third time, he awakened them with the news his betrayer was coming and they must go meet him. Now we come to verse 48. Now he who was betraying him gave them a sign, saying, "Whomever I kiss, he is the one, seize him." Immediately Judas went to Jesus and said, "Hail, Rabbi," and kissed him. And Jesus said to him, Friend, do what you have come for. Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus reached and drew out his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, Put your sword back into its place, for all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword. Now we look at the commentary. As Jesus spoke, Jesus arrived in the garden. Judas arrived in the garden. He was accompanied by a large crowd, including both Roman soldiers and Jews from the temple guard, dispatched by the chief priests and the elders. The crowd had swords and clubs and torches and lanterns. The large group was considered necessary to make sure Jesus did not get away. Judas had arranged a sign with the officials. The one he kissed would be the one to arrest. As he approached Jesus, he said, Hail, Rabbi, and kissed him. Jesus' response indicated that he still loved him, for Jesus addressed him as friend. Then the arresting soldiers seized Jesus. Peter grabbed his sword and attempted to defend Jesus by striking out at one of the arresting group, Malchus, the servant of the high priest. Jesus immediately stopped the violence and reprimanded Peter for his efforts. Now we look at verse 53. Or do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12,000 legions of angels? How then will the scriptures be fulfilled which say that it must happen this way? At that time Jesus said to the crowds, Have you come out with the swords and clubs to arrest me as you would against a robber? Every day I used to sit in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But all this has taken place to fulfill the scriptures of the prophets. Then all the disciples left him and fled, just as he told them earlier that evening. Look at the commentary. Jesus did not need anyone's defense, for he could have called on his Father, who would have sent 12 legions of angels to defend him. A Roman legion numbered about 6,000, so that's a lot. But it was not God's will for Jesus to be rescued. Jesus' arrest occurred because he permitted it. Luke, the physician, noted that Jesus healed the man's severed ear. Matthew did record a brief speech by Jesus to his captors. He asked them why they had come out in this manner to arrest him. He had been in their midst every day teaching in the temple courts this past week of the Passover. Obviously, the religious leaders feared the people's acknowledgement of him. But the will of the Father was being fulfilled as well as the writings of the prophets who spoke of his death. At that point, all the disciples deserted Jesus and fled into the night, though they vowed they would never do so. In verse 57, we read, Those who had seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and elders were gathered together. But Peter was following him at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and he entered in and sat down with the officers to see the outcome. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus so that they might put him to death. So look at the comment here. After Jesus was arrested in Gethsemane, he was led by the soldiers to Caiaphas, the high priest, but first there was a brief trial before the former high priest, Annas, who was Caiaphas' father-in-law. That delaying tactic apparently gave Caiaphas time to assemble the Sanhedrin quickly. Peter followed the Lord at a distance. The purpose of Jesus' trials was to find some legal basis on which to condemn him to death. Judas's testimony was crucial to the religious leader's case, but he was nowhere to be found. As a result, witnesses were sought against Jesus, attempting to find anything that would make him worthy of death. Look at verse number 60. They did not find any, even though many false witnesses came forward. But later on, two came forward and said, This man stated, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days. The high priest stood up and said to him, do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you? But Jesus kept silent. And the high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God. Look at the commentary. While many false witnesses volunteered, none of them could agree on anything except anything against Jesus. Finally, 2 witnesses agreed that Jesus had once said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days. Jesus had said that approximately 3 years earlier at the outset of his ministry, referring not to the temple building but to his body. It is interesting that this statement was here recalled soon before his crucifixion and resurrection. Jesus refused to answer any of the charges brought before him because he was never officially charged with any crime. Then the high priest attempted to get Jesus to respond to the accusation brought against him. Still, Jesus remained silent until the high priest placed him under an oath by the living God. Once the high priest charged Jesus under an oath by the living God, Jesus had to answer truthfully. So now we look at verse 64. Jesus said to him, You have said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his robes and said, He has blasphemed. What further need do we have of witnesses? Behold, you have now heard the blasphemy. What do you think? They answered, He deserves death. Then they spat in his face and beat him with their fists. And others slapped him and said, Prophesy to us, you Christ, who is the one who hit you. Caiaphas insisted that Jesus answered if he was the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. Jesus answered in the affirmative, adding that in the future he would sit at the right hand of the Mighty One and would return on the clouds of heaven. Here was a clear statement of his deity, clearly understood as such by the high priest, who immediately tore his clothes and declared that Jesus had spoken blasphemy. The people had only 2 choices. One, to acknowledge Jesus spoke the truth and fall down and worship him as Messiah. The other was to reject him as a blasphemer and put him to death. They chose the latter. Then they took it upon themselves to begin to punish the accused. They spat in his face, beat him with their fists, and they slapped him. Verse 69. Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him and said, You too were with Jesus the Galilean. But he denied it before them all, saying, I do not know what you're talking about. When he had gone out to the gateway, another servant girl saw him and said to those who were there, This man was with Jesus of Nazareth. And again he denied it with an oath, I do not know the man. A little later the bystanders came up and said to Peter, Surely you too are one of them, for even the way you talk gives you away. Now look at the commentary. While Jesus was undergoing his trial before the Sanhedrin, Peter was also undergoing a testing. He had followed the Lord and gained entrance into the courtyard of the high priest. As he was awaiting the outcome of the trial, he had 3 opportunities to speak up for his Lord. All 3 times Peter denied he ever knew the accused or was in any way ever connected with him. The first denial occurred when a servant girl said in front of the others that he was one of those who had been with Jesus. Another girl at the gate of the courtyard more directly pointed Peter out as one who had indeed been with Jesus. Finally, a number of those present came and accused Peter of being one who had been with Jesus, for his Galilean accent gave him away. And now we come to verse 74. Then he began to curse and swear. Peter said, I do not know the man, and immediately a rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the word which Jesus had said, Before a rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and he wept bitterly. Look at the commentary. With the third accusation, Peter began to call down curses on himself, and he swore. The calling of curses on himself was a legal way of seeking to affirm one's innocence. If the calamities did not follow, he would be assumed innocent. As Peter publicly denied the Lord the third time, immediately a rooster crowed. That triggered in his thinking the words of the Lord. Peter knew immediately he had failed the Lord, though he had affirmed he would never forsake the Lord. He had publicly denied the one he loved. Filled with remorse, he left the courtyard and wept bitterly. His tears were tears of true repentance for having forsaken and denied the Lord Jesus Christ. And that concludes part 2 of chapter 26.